Hey everyone, welcome back to another vlog here. I wanted to talk about one of my projects that I've been working on. It's been kind of a long, sort of drawn out project. Had some success, had some failure, but I want to talk about a camera that I've been trying to convert from a standard DSLR camera to monochrome. Now those of you who have done some research into astrophotography are probably already familiar with some of the reasons why you might do a monochrome camera as part of your setup. Color cameras use a set of tiny little filters that get printed over the sensor, and that's what creates red, green, and blue pixels in our images. And the camera then interprets all these little red, green, and blue pixels as a color. So it kind of combines some of the neighboring pixels to interpret what the color is in that general part of our image. But with a monochrome camera, we don't have that. And there are some advantages and disadvantages that go along with that. The advantage of doing that means that I don't have pixels that are specifically red or green or blue. And that means that every single pixel can get any kind of color or any kind of light. And the big advantage there then is if I do narrowband imaging, or if I do RGB monochrome imaging like red, green, and blue filters, or even any other color if I want, every single pixel is going to be getting color or getting light. And that means I have a much more sensitive sensor to everything. I don't block some of that light from reaching some of the pixels. So I can reduce my imaging time, or I can capture more detail in a shorter period of time using a monochrome camera. The downside to a monochrome camera then is that you pretty much have to use filters. I mean, I guess you could image things in black and white, and that's cool. I've seen some really neat black and white images, but the monochrome cameras, especially if you're doing what I'm doing, it's basically converting it into a full spectrum camera. That is also monochrome. So it's going to get UV, it's going to get infrared as well as all visible light, and that may not be desirable. But monochrome cameras, the downside there is using filters. You can capture anything you want, but you put a filter in front of it to say this is my red channel, this is my blue channel, this is my green channel, and then you have to use software, Photoshop, PixInsight, whatever, to try and combine all of those images together into a composite color image. So there are some downsides too. It takes a lot more work in order to do composite images like that, separate RGB and then luminance channels. But that extra sensitivity means that you can often get a lot more detail in those images. So the extra work ends up paying off by giving you a really nice detailed image in the end. So we can sort of balance how much work we want to do. If you're not willing to do that, you can stick with one-shot color cameras and try and capture all that color at once. But if you want to get into that narrowband or monochrome and RGB filters, you pretty much have to end up going with a monochrome camera. But monochrome cameras are expensive, and I don't have the money to just throw at a monochrome camera. If you're looking at the ZWO ASI 1600 mm Pro, right? Good camera, but expensive. You're looking at, even on the used market, spending at least $800, maybe more. If you're buying new, it's going to be over $1,000, and then you still have to buy filters. We haven't even gotten to the filters, so do you buy the cheaper filters? I would probably go with at least something like astronomic filters are known to be really good, or you can go higher up than that. You can get Bayer filters, which are good too, but even then Astrodon filters are sort of the benchmark as far as hobbyist or even professional filters go. So you're looking at spending hundreds or possibly even thousands on top of that for the filters in order to do narrowband or monochrome imaging. So it's not a cheap investment, and anywhere that you can save some money is maybe a good thing. So I decided instead of throwing money at the problem, I wanted to try to convert my DSLR camera into a monochrome camera, which is no small feat. Let me tell you, after investigating how to do this, it's kind of intimidating. But I'm going to show you more or less how I did it. I'm not going to actually go through it because I've already done it, but I at least want to explain the process, the steps, the tools that I used in order to build or convert my camera. This is a Canon 7D. It's an APS-C sensor, so a crop sensor Canon camera, but I wanted one of these because I already have a 7D Mark II, and this uses the same batteries and stuff, so I wanted to try and keep everything in the same family. I didn't want to buy more accessories than I had to. So I found one of these used on Craigslist, maybe a couple $100, which is not that cheap, but it's a lot cheaper than buying a monochrome Astro camera. So let's take a look at what I ended up doing here to convert this. So I'm going to turn my camera this way. So let's start by talking about exactly what needs to happen in order to convert this camera to monochrome. Now I have some of my past mistakes here. Let's take a look. And if we take a look at these sensors, as I mentioned before, there's essentially a bunch of little red, green, and blue filters that are printed over the top of the sensor. And that's what gives each individual pixel a red, green, or blue value. And then the camera knows which pixels are which, and it goes ahead and interprets the color of the image. So what I've done is I've actually removed this layer for red, green, and blue light. So I've taken the filters off entirely. The downside of doing this is that you can't just take it off. It's not something that you can peel off. It's not something that is just placed over the sensor. It's not a filter you can remove. It is literally something that you have to physically take off of the sensor somehow. And in my case, I did that using physical removal. I scraped it. Which sounds really scary, and the first couple times I did this, it really was. It was scary. It kind of made me nervous. But that's how we would do this. Some cameras, this is a little bit easier than others. In this case, again, I just scraped it off. But you have to be really careful. Once you get to this point here, there's these super tiny gold wires that go along either side here. And that's what connects all the electronics inside the sensor to the board. And if you damage any of those little wires, they are super tiny. I mean, we're talking thousandths of an inch thick. You will ruin your camera, the sensor, if you damage those gold wires. If there's really no good way to put those back. If you damage them, they're so tiny you can't really solder them back into position unless you have some sort of micro soldering tool. So it is not any small thing by any means. If you decide to try this, do not blame me if you ruin a sensor. I went through 4 of these. 4 sensors now. I'm on my 4th one that's in the camera. And so I've ruined 3 of them trying to get to this point. And yeah, then you have to buy another sensor and try it all over again. So that's basically what we're doing. We're going to scrape off that red, green, and blue filter array, also known as a Bayer matrix or Bayer array or RGB filter array or whatever you want to call it. We're going to scrape that off the sensor to reveal the bare photosites underneath that are going to capture all light. All right, so we're just taking those filters off. So that's the plan. Now, doing this, let's talk about tools. What kind of tools do we need to make it happen? Now, the first thing that I would recommend is make sure you have a set of screwdrivers. I have this set of small precision screwdrivers that I bought for electronics work, and this worked out really nicely. If I go ahead and open this up, I've got 3 different types of screwdrivers. You've got your flathead screwdrivers here. There's 3 different sizes. I've got on the right my Phillips or cross recessed screws. I guess that's the generic term. But you've got your Phillips head screwdrivers here. And then lastly, in the middle, these 2 red ones are actually designed for star screws. So they're star bits. And I actually needed these for taking out the sensor in the camera. So this Canon 7D camera that I have here, taking out the sensor, the screws that held the sensor in were actually, they were small star bit screws. So I needed those to take that out. Now your camera might vary. It's going to depend on what you've got. I can't tell you what's in your camera. I can only tell you what was inside my Canon 7D, but you'll find out when you open it up. So screwdrivers, that's tool number 1, big one. Now tool number 2, I used a hobby knife, an X-Acto knife, whatever you want to call it. They have these thin little blades. You can kind of wedge them underneath stuff. I actually used this to remove filters from in front of the sensor, and it's really easy to get underneath there and gently pry them off. You have to be really careful. These filters have super thin glass, so I had to be gentle, and this ended up working out pretty nicely. Another good tool, tweezers. If you have some long, thin tweezers, these are great for getting screws out of tight places or putting a screw back into a tight place. I actually used a paper clip. I know it seems kind of weird, but I used a paper clip because there are ribbon cables inside of here, and those ribbon cables have little holes. So when I take the board out or put the board back in and I want to put those ribbon cables back into place or take them out, I can just hook the paper clip in the little hole and pull, or hook the little paper clip in the hole and kind of gently push and try and get the ribbon cable to seat back in its connector. So that actually was kind of neat. I really liked using this, so who knew? Paper clips. Other tools. I used some metal polish. This is actually what I used to take off the printed film over the sensor, the RGB matrix or the bare matrix. I took that off using this metal polish. I also used a wooden dowel. I sharpened this to a point. This is what I started removing that film with, and then I finished it by using this metal polish. So this is sort of a gentle-ish tool to begin that physical removal process. So those are the big tools, the things that I use. Oh, can't forget one more thing. A lighter. I needed fire to actually open up the sensor itself, and so I got one of these lighters. This is sort of a, it's not the super jet style butane lighter, but it does kind of have that. So you probably can't see it there, but it's sort of got that a little bit of a jet flame to it. It helps me really keep that focused in the area that I want it. And I'll explain that in just a minute here. So those are the tools that I use to open up the camera, put it back together. You may use some other things, but that's what I ended up putting into use here. Now the sensor itself is made up of multiple layers. Okay, there's multiple layers. Now the sensor is what we've got underneath. The sensor is going to sit on a frame. I've got a piece of that here. That kind of sits in front of that. And then there's a piece that sits behind it. There's some shielding and so on. So you'll have to use some screws to kind of get some of that off. But there is a frame that goes over the sensor here. So it kind of pins it all together. We can see a bit how that all sort of sits together there. Now when I took this apart, there's some sticky tape. I used the craft knife or the hobby knife here to help try and peel that off. I don't know if you can see that, the green tape that's on there. Use that to kind of peel it away. But there's also a glass filter in here. Now I've broken pretty much all of mine. I want the frame, but I didn't want the filter. And so that blue filter, there's a blue piece of glass in here. That's going to be one of the two filters in front of the camera. You've got an infrared filter and a UV filter. And so we want to take those filters out so I can get at the sensor. So I've broken that little blue piece of glass. That's the UV filter. We also have this little guy. This is actually a combination piece. This is a filter. We can see how it's still intact here. But this is the infrared filter. Typically, manufacturers will put this over so you don't get weird infrared light, or it's not too red or odd looking for standard daytime photography. But we actually kind of like getting rid of this for astrophotography because that helps enhance the red colors, the hydrogen alpha in our images. If you do deep space or deep sky astrophotography of nebulas and stuff, we want that hydrogen alpha color to come through, and taking this out will improve the sensitivity of your sensor to that color of light. So we can take this off, but this is also the piezo piece. You can see there's a little electrical connector here. This is a piezo piece that cleans the sensor. If you think of something like an ultrasonic cleaner that kind of buzzes and it shakes and it gets your jewelry clean and that kind of stuff, yeah, this is sort of a tiny version of that. And so when I shut the camera down or I start it up, usually this will fire off a little buzz and it kind of shakes a little bit of dust off of the sensor. That's great, but I can't separate that. So the only option I have is to take that off along with this. But that's actually not that bad for astrophotography, because when I take this off, that means that any dust that's on the sensor is going to stay on the sensor. And so when I take my flat frames, and the flat frames are going to capture the dust that I saw when I was imaging in my light frames, it's going to help subtract those out and even out the light wherever I had dust on my image. And so this is actually detrimental to that. I think you can turn this off in the camera, but now I can never have to worry about it again. So that is the IR filter. We also took out the UV filter that was basically stuck in here with tape or glue. I pulled that out. So those were the first layers that had to come off. I unscrew the frame, kind of gently peel it away, and take off the filters that are inside of there. Try not to break the glass or make it shatter all over the place if you do this. But there's one more piece of glass. There's a tiny clear piece of glass here that sits over the sensor to seal it and protect it. It's kind of funny because a lot of people worry about scratching their sensor when they're cleaning. But you really don't have to worry that much about it because there's, 3 layers of glass in between the camera sensor and you. So you may scratch one of these filters, but you're not actually going to scratch the sensor. So you might still be able to send it back into the manufacturer and have them replace that, and they can repair your camera without doing a whole lot of work. But this is epoxy down, and getting this off is the scary part, because if you break this piece of glass is very hard, it's very sharp. It can scratch into the sensor if you're not careful. So even if you shatter it and there's little pieces on here, as you're wiping them away, you could actually scratch the sensor. You also have to watch out for those tiny little gold wires that I mentioned. Those little gold wires, again, if you break those, damage them, you could basically brick the sensor, and then you got to start all over again. You get black images or something weird, maybe half of it's black, half of it's actually still usable, or you get dead pixels or something in your sensor. So taking this off, that's where the lighter came in. So I took the lighter, basically just gently heat around here, give it a rest, gently heat around, give it a rest. Just keep doing that until this epoxy around here basically all just turns white. And that means that it's breaking, it's releasing, and you'll gently work your hobby knife underneath there very, very slowly, and slowly begin to pry that away from the sensor. Again, trying not to break it, trying not to crack it. You can gently get that off your sensor. So between heat and your little bit of mechanical pressure with the hobby knife, you can very carefully remove this. We can't really put that back. That might be nice, but if I put that back, it might trap humid air or something in there, or it could trap dust or something else. I'm not going to bother putting that back. So the frame I will put back after I've gone ahead and converted the sensor, and that will more or less kind of cover those gold wires and give it some protection. So it's not perfect, but it is better than leaving it exposed. So that's sort of the setup of the sensor, right? We got these different filters, some layers of glass. They all have to come off, and we can do that using some mechanical means, a little bit of fire, kind of gently heat the epoxy and peel that off. Now, once you've exposed the sensor, that's where the real challenge begins. So I used this frame as a guide. I took this glass out, kind of cleaned it up, and then put this back over the sensor to protect those gold wires. It should kind of fit itself back into position here, and especially if you put this frame back in, there's some little locating holes, some little pins on here, and then I'll just kind of pop back into position over there. But I use this back over the top as a guide, kind of protect the gold wires around the outside that I mentioned are super fragile. And then I also use that as a guide with my dowel or my Q-tip. I used a cotton swab, and I would kind of hold this down and scrape up against here, angle it in a little bit, and I can use that to kind of figure out how do I create the perimeter of the area that I want to scrape off. And then I can work in between, in the middle, kind of get all that stuff going. Once I started to get through the outer layer of the Bayer matrix, that's when I started to introduce the metal polish. That's going to be a little bit abrasive and help you really start to take off, almost like really fine sandpaper. It's going to help you take down that layer of epoxy filters over the top there until you get down to the photosites. And you'll know that you got into the photosites. You can kind of see, hopefully, the difference there. I'll just take that away. You can see the difference around the perimeter. The epoxy layer with the filters is still there, and in the middle we've removed the Bayer matrix. So we've exposed the photosites. So if you look at that in the light, you'll actually see more of a rainbow around areas that are still covered, and the middle area that I've removed there will be more just kind of gold. And that way you know you've gotten through that Bayer matrix layer over the top. The other part of this is you can't go too deep, because right next to every single pixel, if we imagine this is one pixel, right, one big pixel, next to those in between the pixels, they've actually created some super tiny electronics, little transistors, resistors, whatever, that are used to transmit the captured photon data back to the processor in the camera. And if you go too deep, you can hit those and damage them, and then you either get individual dead pixels, or oftentimes they're kind of linked together either in rows or columns, and if you hit one of those, you can often just kill an entire row or column of pixels. If you went too far in a large enough area and you damaged too many of those photosites, you could actually, again, just completely black out the sensor or black out a chunk of it. Again, you got to use a fine touch on this, really gentle, and only go as deep as you need to. And again, this took me 3 previous attempts to start to understand how far to take this when I go into my own camera and my own sensor, the one that now works. So here's the 7D. If I open this up, I don't know if you'll be able to see this or not. Kind of down in there. grab my phone, we'll shine a little bit of light in there so you can see down in there. You can see the sensor that's exposed, and I've scraped that bare layer out of the middle of the sensor. I left a little perimeter around there. There are still some little bits of electronics around the perimeter, and even though I want to take that bare matrix off all the way to the perimeter, I have to be really careful, because if you go a little bit too far outside of that, you again could hit the little electronics, especially in this blue border around the edges. If you put that under a microscope or a macro lens or something, you'll probably see some of that inside of underneath that blue layer. So we want to make sure we don't hit any of that. We want to make sure we don't go too deep. So again, I used the wooden dowel to kind of scrape and get an initial start on there. And the wood, this is oak. It's hard enough to do this. You don't want to use something like pine. It's probably too soft. The oak will maintain a little bit of a sharp point there, so you can really kind of dig in and start getting into that. But anyway, I like the oak. The oak worked really well. Once I got into that, I used a little bit of this metal polish and then continue kind of scraping until I know that I got through that main layer. And then I used cotton swabs. So once I was through that layer, I knew I could start kind of eroding around the edges of the scratches. So I'd put a little dab on there and just start working and just kind of rub circles back and forth until I could start to see that layer disappearing. Once that was through, you can put it under a light, kind of see how deep you are. If you still see little areas that seem like maybe you haven't quite gotten through there, you can still work on that. Just again, be really gentle, be careful not to overdo it, or you'll go too deep and hit the photo sites or the little electronics next to them. It took me multiple tries to figure this out. I followed some online forum posts about how to do this. Other people have attempted this as well. We looked at maybe doing some chemical removal of that layer, but couldn't really find anything. That seems to be some sort of cross-linked polymer on there that is really resistant to any type of solvents. I think there's some stuff out there that could work, but it's probably really nasty and really hard to get your hands on. All right, so let's look at a couple of example images. I took some test shots using the Canon 7D after I've converted it to monochrome. First up is a simple flat frame that I took against a white background. Nothing fancy. I just took it without the lens on so that you get fairly even illumination. And I just wanted to inspect it and see if I could see any issues or defects with the debayering process. First off, anytime you debayer a camera like this, the camera is going to interpret data as being a lot more red than it typically is. If you recall from earlier, I had removed both the infrared and UV filters, so the sensor is getting a lot more of that red data than it normally would. So that's why when looking at the flat frame here, you can see that it's very, very red or magenta. Now, if we convert that through DC Raw, which is a command line converting tool, it interprets the image however you tell it to. I've run it through that process and converted it into a monochrome version. Now note that anywhere that still has the Bayer matrix over it, which is the perimeter of the image, it still shows color. And that's normal. Anywhere that has that Bayer matrix, it's still going to not quite know what to do with it. It ended up interpreting it as green. And that's fine. I'm not really concerned about that. I'll probably end up cropping all that stuff out anyway. But it looks pretty good. Everything's fairly even, and I don't really see any dirt or specks all over the place. There are a couple little flecks in the upper left, but overall, pretty good. So next, I'm going to take that same flat frame and stretch the heck out of it inside of Photoshop. And this is going to help me really bring out contrast and inspect the flat frame for any defects or anything weird. I can see if I've removed that Bayer matrix layer evenly.
I can see the perimeter around there nice and sharp, and maybe just barely along the right edge there's a thin area that's not quite as even as the rest of the sensor, but in general it's pretty clean, pretty even, and should turn out to be a pretty good sensor. Now lastly, here's a test shot that I took out the window with my standard Canon kit lens, and then I ran it through DC RAW to convert it to monochrome. So you can see the middle of the image is all nice black and white, and then the perimeter is that green funky color through DC RAW interpreting it. Everything looks pretty good. It's fairly sharp. Even the autofocus seemed to work pretty well, but I had stopped it down to about f8, and in general, everything looks pretty darn good. So I'm excited to give this a try on some astro targets.
All right, now I haven't tested this yet since I've converted it again. My first attempt was actually perfect. It worked. The problem I ran into the first time though was after I put it back together, I noticed there's some little black flecks that were on the sensor. So when I took a picture, I could see them. And even though taking flats, you could probably get rid of them, or I could just clone stamp them out using Photoshop or Lightroom, it bugged me. And I ended up trying to remove them. I used the oak dowel. I actually tried a brass rod the first time, and that was hard enough to get through the layer, but I ended up hitting something. I scratched something, and boom, sensor dead. The second attempt I tried this, I went a little too fast. I got impatient, and right out of the gate, the sensor wouldn't work. Half of the image was black, and the other half could see stuff in the middle, and the border was sort of muddled and fuzzy. So that didn't work out. The third attempt, again, worked. But what I did is I started developing a cooling system. And when I added my cooling system to it, I left a burr on one of the pieces, and it scratched the back of the sensor and ended up causing regular columns of dead pixels. So that was pretty irritating that I ruined another sensor. Long term, the plan is to add that cooling system back in. I've since kind of sanded down the edges, try to polish it off a little bit. Definitely not for the faint of heart. You really want to not care about the camera. Fully expect that you're going to screw it up. If you're going to try this, just assume that you'll probably brick at least one sensor. Some people have had great success right out of the gate, and that's awesome. Like I said, my first sensor actually worked. I thought it was just going to be dead, but I was willing to give it a whirl, and sure enough, it worked. But do not expect that kind of success. If you try this yourself, expect that you will end up going through at least one or two or three or multiple sensors, and you can get replacements on eBay. I used eBay to get some new sensors. They ship from China, take a week or two to show up. The Canon 7D sensors right now are around 60 bucks. So every time I ruin a sensor, chuck it, throw it out another 60 bucks, get a new sensor. I actually set it down after the third attempt, and I ruined it, and I said, screw it, I'm done. But I couldn't let it sit. I didn't know what else to do with the camera. It had a non-working sensor, and I didn't know if I could sell it for parts or what. And so I just, all right, let's give it another try. And now I've got a working sensor again. It's actually even better than the first few times that I had tried it, because that polish, this Moz metal polish, it actually worked really, really well. I was able to gently remove that layer, smooth it out, and get a nice, clean middle portion of my sensor. So, highly recommend that method if you're going to try it. Again, I can't tell you if it's going to work or not, and I don't know what kind of touch you're going to have versus what I have. I tried to go slow, I tried to be gentle, but it's really easy to mess them up, and not every sensor is as easy to work on. So again, if you're going to try it, highly encourage you to post comments. If you try it yourself, let me know, did it work? Point me to some pictures. If you take pictures with your own monochrome camera, I'd love to see them. But I plan on trying this out. I'll throw it on my telescope and see if I can get any cool pictures. Maybe take some narrowband hydrogen alpha, or eventually maybe do some RGB imaging. We'll see. The problem with these DSLRs though, noise. The sensors get warm, you start getting noise, and that's why I want to do the cooling. I'll probably tinker a little bit with the monochrome camera as it sits so that I can see how well it performs even just without cooling. So thanks for sticking around and listening to me ramble about my monochrome camera mod. I found it really fascinating. I learned a lot as I took my camera apart and understood how the sensor was actually made. Taking off that layer was nerve-wracking when I did it the first couple of times, but I feel pretty good about this one. I think we got a winner. So keep your eyes peeled for some pictures. I'll probably put a link to my Flickr account if you want to check out any of my other images. I also do have a place where you can buy some of my digital prints if you're interested. I'll put a link for that as well down in the description. So if you like this video, hit that subscribe, and I hope to see you again in the next video.